Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this hour-long webinar where we help you unpack what just happened with the HLPF, the annual check-in on how the SDGs are going. I, with my ISD colleagues, Eleonora Bonacorsi and Trina Schmidt, along with Javier Surowski from CEPE, we'll be discussing how the HLPF went, themes that emerged, what happened with the VNRs, the VLRs, and the 2020 targets during the next 30 minutes. And then I'll come back and conclude with an overview of where we go from here. And then we're going to open up the floor for your questions. So please be thinking about them as we go. First, a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to do some polls. We'd like to know where you're coming from, what sectors you work in. And also, please use the Q&A portion function for your questions. We'll be using those to moderate the discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eleonora Bonacorsi to talk about these the polls and then to kick it off.
Thank you, Lynn, and welcome everyone. So I can see that Matthew put the poll. Please, yeah, you can start voting already. I'm not sure. So what region are you joining from? So please select the region and also what sector, which sector do you represent? Academia, civil society, government, international organizations, media, or other. I'm not able to see the results just yet. But I guess we will wait for a couple of seconds before we can show the results. Matthew, any news on the votes? Yes, okay, so perfect. So yes, okay, so 35% from North America, 11% from Latin America, 35% from Europe, and yes, as well from South America, Western Asia, East Asia, and Africa. In terms of sectors, in terms of diversity in the room, we can see that civil society and academia are almost the same participation, while international organizations, 30%. Other, I'm interested to know what other is, if you can maybe write that in the chat if you like. Otherwise, I guess we can close this poll and start with the presentation, Matthew. Yeah, perfect. Also, Matthew, if you before we start with this presentation, with my observations about this year's HLPF, we would also like to ask you a general question on what are the themes that you observed at this year's HLPF, and you can answer this question throughout this session today. So my colleague Matthew will put this question in the chat, and then we can start with this presentation about our observations of this year's HLPF. Thank you, Matthew, for sharing the screen. Of course, we have the ENB. Actually, I wanted to, if you can maybe go back a bit, yes. So I want to thank also the colleagues at the ENB reporting service, without whom I couldn't provide my observation for today's HLPF. They really helped me to navigate this, this quite dense forum. Thank you. For the next slide, Matthew, please. So I just want to provide a quick snapshot about this year HLPF. Doesn't look Yeah, perfect. So we, as you can see below, we have the SDG squares. Those are the SDGs that were reviewed this year during the voluntary national reviews by 42 countries. You can see the composition indeed of by region in the map next to it. And then there was the, in parallel to these VNRs, there were 17 VNR labs where countries share the best practices and lesson learned in drafting these voluntary national reviews that indeed review the progress of SDGs in a country. At the same time, we have there were 276 side events, including, in addition to 8 special events and 2 high-level launches reports. I invite you as well to visit the official HLPF website to understand better the special events and reports that were launched for more information.
How you can get interorganizational collaboration.
If you can please mute your microphone. Thank you. So there were like 12 online exhibitions taking place on the sideline of the HLPF. Those are indeed exhibition of organization showing indeed success stories about implementation of the SDGs, and also SDG media zone, where they held interactive interviews on the SDGs. In terms of participation, and I also thank the Department of Economic and Social Affairs for sharing this data. There were 190 speakers with sorry, if you can go back maybe in the slide. Yes, 8 heads of states and government, 1 former head of government, and more than 100 deputy prime minister, and vice ministers. Thank you, Matthew. I'll now quickly touch on few points on how the second online HLPF go in terms of accessibility and inclusion, as well as attendance and interactions and information available. So in terms of accessibility, it was possible. This year is the second year we have an online HLPF. Actually, this time was hybrid for the where in-presence meeting were held for the opening of the HLPF and the high-level segment of ECOSOC and the closing as well. Otherwise, the full HLPF was held online with the broadcasted on the UN TV, but also accessible through other social media platforms. There was also simultaneous interpretation in the 6 UN languages, and in terms of inclusion, I have noticed in many of these sessions at the HLPF that many stakeholders mentioned that how the online and hybrid format can broaden the participation of other actors. But at the same time, it was mentioned how this is contingent to the issue of digital equity, which was reiterated in many of this session, and also in a specific side events when talking about digitalization, especially in a report by civil society. And how indeed the digitalization is a key lever for a recovery that leaves no one behind. In terms of participation of major groups and other stakeholders, it was possible indeed to interact through during the presentation of the VNRs through statements, but also through side events, and I've also seen that many VNRs included. We're starting to see many civil society organization reports included in the voluntary national review as an annex or in the actual text of the report, as well as I also saw how stakeholders were as well presented in the presentation of in the VNR, and also in answering questions from the audience. then the other thing that I want to mention, it's in terms of major groups voices. I saw indeed that the youth, the women's major group, the indigenous people, the stakeholder group of persons with disability were quite present in this conversation and in the follow-up questions and discussions to these VNRs. And also more momentum was given to the regional and local dimension. This year, indeed, it was the first time we have this special event on the regional and local government forum. And also we had as well the messages from the regions and many other side events where the local dimension was highlighted. I won't talk much on this local dimension, as I know my colleague Javier from CEPE will touch more on this conversation. But before I close my remarks, I also want to mention that the SDG Media Zone, which is indeed this space where they have this interactive conversation. This year they had a new sub-brand which is called SDG Media Zone Plus for local and regional conversation. So we definitely saw how this local dimension had more momentum in this year HLPF. I'll pass it now to my colleague Trine, and she will follow up on the main messages about this year HLPF. But please, you can still answer in the chat about which team you observe at this year's forum. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Eleonora. And now I'll speak a little bit about some of the main themes that we saw coming out at this year's high-level political forum. And a good place to start might be, well, are we making progress or not? And that seems to always be a theme and always topical when we speak about the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, the Secretary General summed it up very well in one sentence when he said that we're here to review the Sustainable Development Goals, but in fact, we're moving further away from the goals. Speaking on the opening of the ministerial segment, he highlighted the interlinkages between climate emergency, hunger, and inequality. And stressing the access to healthy diets, he also highlighted the food system summits due to take place in September and stated that in a world of plenty, we're failing to provide what is fundamental right for people around the world. So I will say that already there we've seen that there's a very big focus around the upcoming food systems, with many speakers mentioning that this is the moment where we really need to address not only hunger and nutrition, but in the connection to the climate and biodiversity goals. So as I promised, I'll say a few words about the main themes of this year's HLPF, which for me really stood out as the year where we spoke about the systemic challenges of making progress on the agenda, including structural inequality and financing the SDGs. Speakers throughout the sessions from both government representatives, civil society, academia sounded alarm over the growing inequalities that we are seeing more clearly now with the COVID-19 pandemic mirroring the existing inequalities, but at the same time also new emerging inequalities both within countries and between countries, and a growing divide, especially when we speak about the vaccine, as I'll turn to in a moment. One such inequality that we've also heard a lot about at this HLPF is with respect to the digital connectivity and more concretely internet access. And while it might seem that we've been speaking about the digital divide for at least the past 10 years, this has only become more pronounced during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we've really seen people left behind in terms of the access to healthcare information, access to online education and work, and which ultimately haven't allowed people the opportunity to maintain a livelihood during the pandemic. And we've seen especially that in the African region that this is where people have been falling behind. Another big theme that I particularly enjoyed following was on financing. From the very moment that HLPF opened and throughout HLPF, there was a focus on an overhaul of our economic system, with mentioning on the opening panel, there was a big focus on the constraints on countries' ability to invest in recovery and climate resilience, due to the unequal access to investments, and liquidity was also really a key theme. In one of the panels on investings in the SDGs, it was stated that global investments have shrunk by a third due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and less than 10% of these investment goes to developing countries. So as a consequence, perhaps we heard many calls for innovative finance mechanisms and the need to step up in an era of partnerships where we really bring development, the development sector and private sector together. And these calls were made both from academia, but also countries and civil society. Civil society, especially from developing countries, also really zoomed in on the unbalanced decision-making power that we see in the international financial system. And it was stressed that when investing in the SDGs, we have to address the systemic global inequalities of wealth and power. And this quite naturally leads us to speak about tax havens and the aggressive tax evasion that we've seen by multinational corporations. This was a big theme that was mentioned by both member states and civil society. And there was a call for the UN General Assembly to negotiate an international tax treaty. So you could say that at a time where countries are really struggling with the recession brought on by COVID-19, and at the same time a need to invest in social protection system, healthcare, etc., to not further the negative consequences on their people from this pandemic. There was a really strong focus around debt sustainability because countries are squeezed, and there were many calls for a more equitable debt architecture, including both debt relief, but also restructuring, and not only for low-income countries, but also for middle-income countries. Many speakers pointed out that the current debt relief structures that we see in place are simply far from adequate. And specifically the European Network on Debt and Development highlighted that there's a lack for integration of human rights, gender equality, and climate considerations when we speak about debt sustainability, giving the example that if countries are able to pay back debt while they're cutting on investments in healthcare and climate resilience, that in effect turns out bottom line to look like sustainability in their debt financing or servicing. And then speaking about the growing social divide and the inequality that we've seen throughout HLPF, of course, there was the enormous topic of vaccine equity. So access to vaccines and health services was something that was mentioned over and over and over again. There were demands for the COVID-19 vaccine to be a public good, and several calls on more funding for the COVAX facility. It was mentioned that only 1% in low-income countries are currently vaccinated, with especially Africa lagging behind, and that we need 11 billion doses to vaccinate 70% of the world's population. And overall, I would say that aside from vaccine equity, there was a strong focus and call for universal healthcare and strong calls in general for universal social protection systems, where we've to not further the falling behind that we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. Another thing that I want to briefly mention is the One Health approach. That was also something we heard a lot mentioned during HLPF. So this approach on integrating policies on the health of our planet as well as on human well-being. And this was something, of course, that was brought up a lot when we're looking towards the Food System Summit. There was an attempt to include it in the ministerial declaration. However, this was negotiated out of the final document. And then lastly, many youth organizations and youth representatives from governments spoke on the human rights violations of the climate crisis and the intergenerational inequality that we see in that sense. And in that vein, I just want to mention that there was launched the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, which was championed by Costa Rica and Denmark. 49 member states have signed on to this, and there are 27 supporting organizations, including both UN entities and civil society organizations. And this pledge really shows the determination to uphold human rights law and principles in the recovery, urging for a sustainable recovery. And of course, that was, as we've all seen, the main theme of this year was a sustainable recovery from the pandemic. I'll now turn it over to Javier Suraski from CEPE who'll speak about the VNRs and the VLRs, and not least the 2020 targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trin. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me here to share with you some initial thoughts immediately after the HLPF. I will address, as Trina said, three different but interconnected issues: VNRs, VLRs, and the so-called 2020 targets, which is the set of SDG targets with maturity in the past year. And I will finish my short presentation with an equally quick conclusion. So first, the VNRs. Since the first round of voluntary national reviews reports in 2016, VNRs has become the stars of each HLPF session. However, the VNR's role as a cornerstone of the national, regional, and global 2030 agenda follow-up is far from being fulfilled. The national voluntary review process and its reporting are stuck. With few exemptions, each national review is a mirror of the others. No matter how different reporting countries' realities could be, a non-written path to developing a national review process bubbled up to the surface, resulting in an unique to-do list applied to every national context and in every possible situation. As happened with every to-do list, the key is to have every line in the list checked. It is not some strange, for example, that every process includes a multi-stakeholder consultation exercise, and at the same time, civil society is flagging a global civil society shrinking space. NGO speech, for example, at almost every VNR report presentation session at the HLPF, voices the lack of an inclusive VNR building process. It is clear that something is not working as it should. VNRs are also not progressing. Improvements on its quality are rare, and the transition from first-generation VNRs, in which countries reports moments or pictures in its way towards the SDGs implementations, and second-generation VNRs, in which countries reporting processes or films, not pictures, of implementations, I say the movement from first to second VNRs is simply not taking place. In this framework, VNRs are failing to fulfill their role of being mutual learning and knowledge sharing tools that could accelerate SDGs implementations worldwide. The second issue, the voluntary local reviews or VLRs. As you may know, the VLRs are not considered at the 2030 agenda, and the VLRs were at least partially a reaction to a reaction based on the commitments of city majors with the SDGs in countries whose federal governments were attacking multilateralism. New York City was the first city to report its progress on implementing the SDGs through a voluntary local review in July 2019, together with three small Japanese cities. However, some antecedent, I should say, exist, such as SDGs localizations reports made by cities and regions that started in 2016. Nevertheless, VNRs are gaining attraction as SDGs localization became increasingly important. This year, The HLPF gathers the first ever official meeting on VLRs, and a few reporting governments are including VLRs data in their national reports, increasing VNRs data disaggregation and quality. However, states are still not allowing UNDISA to publish the VLR reports on the HLPF official website. The diversity of interest and realities among cities is huge, and the risk of preformatted VLRs is still low. However, we need to prevent VLRs from following the steps taken by VNRs that I just mentioned. And third, the 2020 targets. 21 targets were supposed to be met in 2020. Although none of them have been achieved, some show some progress, such as the increase in the volume of official development assistance flows for scholarships, or the implementation of regulations to combat illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The failure in reaching the 2020 targets impacts especially on goals with a strong environmental content, like SDG 14 and SDG 15. It would be crucial to remind that most of the 2020 targets were aligned to the Aichi framework on biodiversity that states will review this year. Nevertheless, in my perspective, it is especially serious that we have missed the target 17.18 on supporting statistical capacity building for development countries. This means that we continue to implement the 2030 agenda with limited capacities for data-driven decision-making. We cannot allow the situation experienced with the 2020 targets to be a foretaste of what we'll be discussing in 2031. To have the opportunity to succeed, we urgently need to strengthen evidence-based decision-making, supported by quality data and a much more inclusive process. And having said that, let me move to a final conclusion, because there are many possible ways to overcome VNRs and VLRs' current obstacles, and there are many possible responses to the failure in reaching the 2020 targets. Nevertheless, I think that there is a common need for all of them. It is necessary to listen more and better to the multiple stakeholders' voices, including them in the national structures in charge of implementing the 2030 agenda, promoting a renewed and more muscular, better multilateralism, and creating an increasingly efficient and better financed United Nations. As an ancient wise have said, may the force be with us. I thank you. And I think that it's time to move to our next presenter.
Yes, thank you. And so now I'm going to be looking at what's to come. And in many ways, this offers a wrap up of what my colleagues have just said. There are a number of meetings that are going to be related to these 2020 targets. These are, at this time last year, I had many of these same events on my slide for last year. As we know, the pandemic has led to a lot of events being postponed, canceled, and so we're hoping that many of these events will be taking place either later this year online or at some point in 2022. During the opening of the UNGA session in September, the annual SDG moment will take place, putting the SDGs squarely on the agenda for the leaders from around the world as they come to the opening of the UNGA. I'm not sure if they've decided if it'll be virtual again or if there'll be some hybrid component to that, but the SDG moment is still on the agenda. There are a number of other events that are going to take place during that opening week of the UNGA. One is the high-level dialogue on energy, the first time in about 40 years that the UN, under UN auspices, energy is being discussed. And that's going to be at the summit level. The Food System Summit, my colleagues have already mentioned that a few times. That is bringing together a discussion of food systems in kind of that nexus way, looking at it from a multidimensional perspective. In her closing statement, the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, yesterday mentioned also that there's going to be a high-level meeting on jobs and social protection for poverty reduction during that opening of the UN General Assembly. I don't have that on the list, but that would also be taking place at the high level, bringing the attention of the leaders of the world to these critical issues that have just been discussed at the HLPF. A number of other events taking place under UN auspices related to these 2020 targets and some of the essential work that needs to be done. The UN Global Sustainable Transport Conference, there's a 2020 target related to transport, transportation related deaths. The UN World Data Forum, this was supposed to take place last year. It took place in a hybrid format. It's scheduled again, it took place in an entirely online format last year. This October, it's scheduled to be a hybrid event. But that third annual World Data Forum will be essential for helping us to discuss this digital divide and the statistics that we need to evaluate where we are with the SDGs. The UN Ocean Conference was supposed to take place last year. Currently, the dates haven't been set, but it's anticipated it'll take place next year, 2022. And then there are a series of kind of treaty body negotiations that we've been waiting for. The Convention on Biological Diversities, COP15, as Javier mentioned, a number of the 2020 targets are related to the IEG targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity. That convention is scheduled to take place in October. I think the Bureau of the CBD was meeting yesterday. So watch the SDG Knowledge Hub for news on what format that might take place or if it's going to be postponed. Just a few days ago, the most recent or the first draft for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework was released. So negotiations are ongoing on the new Global Biodiversity Framework, and with that, a number of the 2020 targets will be somehow addressed. The Glasgow Climate Change Conference is currently accepting registrations. It's supposed to be happening in some format in November. The WTO Ministerial Conference was rescheduled from last June to it's going to be happening at the end of November this year. Just yesterday, the the WTO held a high-level ministerial on the fishery subsidies target, SDG 14.6. That was another 2020 target to reduce eliminate fishery subsidies. In the follow-up press conference for that, the DG said that for the first time, ministers had agreed to a negotiating text. She said it was the first time in 20 years that they have a text that they're ready to begin line-by-line negotiations. And she was optimistic that there would be an agreement on fishery subsidies before the end of November WTO ministerial conference. But so watch this, watch the SDG Knowledge Hub space for progress on that. International Conference on Chemicals Management, there's another 2020 target on chemicals management. The ICCM was delayed from last year. It was supposed to happen in mid 2021, but it's been postponed kind of indefinitely, waiting for the pandemic to play out. And then another event that was mentioned during the HLPF was the ITU World Telecommunications Development Conference. And this is an event that happens every 4 years. It's been postponed till next year. But given the emphasis and the discussion about the digital divide, that this will be a really opportune time to discuss that issue and to give momentum to addressing those inequalities. And then at the bottom, certainly not the least important, but to show that this is kind of the base on which all of the international activity can take place, is that the action at the national level and the local level. For VNRs, next year there already are 4 countries that we're anticipating will be giving them. In the next few months, if the pattern holds, countries will be signing up and indicating their interest to present a VNR next year. So we expect that list to be augmented quite a bit in the next few months. And then the local level voluntary local reviews. This came up again and again during the HLPF this year, and we're looking forward to seeing a lot of cities are the SDGs really are resonating with them, with their focus on delivering results, with tracking progress and tracking their performance for their constituents, and that the VLR is kind of a natural extension of that local level planning and local level monitoring to deliver sustainable development for local communities. And so we'll be watching that space too. So with that, I think those are the comments from our side. We look forward to hearing what you were listening to, what your questions are, and how we can together unpack what just happened in the last 2 weeks. And so I'll turn it over to my colleague Matthew ten Bruggencate, who will moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you to all of our panelists. If I could ask the panelists to turn their cameras back on. A reminder, you can either add your question to the chat, or if you look in the middle of your Zoom screen at the bottom, you should see a Q&A function, which allows you to add both a question or to vote for other questions that are already there if you'd like to see the panelists answer that. I wanted to start with a question. We had thought about polling the audience, and perhaps people can also respond to this in the chat. But from each of you, what do you think was missing from this year's HLPF, or what had you hoped to hear that didn't take part in the conversations, either the kind of high-level dialogue or coming from civil society? And anyone who wants to start with that can jump on in.
Maybe if you want, I can open the discussion. And I should say that I missed the same things that I have been missing from the last few years. I missed concrete solutions to the problems. The HLPF has become very good in identifying, highlighting, and flagging the more urgent problems that we are facing in our way towards the 2030 agenda achievement. However, there are not concrete measures. There are not new commitments. They have spoke a lot on the need of raise the level of ambition, but no new measures were proposed. No countries took the lead in achieving particular goals. No countries called others to meet in a specific time, in a specific place to discuss how to move things forward. So, in my opinion, the HLPF is lacking of uh, of a way to translate the ideas that came up during the debates in concrete solutions. That's what I am missing the most.
Yeah. Well, and I think that some of that also when you're there, when the HLPF is happening in person, and you're running from site event to site event, you're picking up some more of those on the ground experiences, and ideas, and you're in the cafes talking about concrete activities. So I certainly do, like Javier, miss that, and also just miss kind of the energy that you get from being there, and seeing the commitment of the people who have come to the HLPF to discuss progress. But that said, there was no shortage of site events online, and the ideas and the possibilities presented during them, I think, was equally rich to if we had been there, but there is just that that energy that you get when everyone's together.
I see a question on the ministerial declaration, Matt. Is it okay if I jump and perhaps speak to some of that? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I can see that there's two questions, both on what we in the panel think about the declaration and also on how difficult it has been and compared to last year. And I think it's a very good question because I think, of course, last year when it was completely virtual, we didn't have the option of adopting the declaration. So this year is the first time since 2018 that we have a ministerial declaration as an outcome of the HLPF. And as you may have followed, the silent procedure was broken 3 times during the last 2 weeks. So I think in no sure way can we say that it has been simple, and there's been good steering from the chairs to get that adopted. I think we can say that getting the declaration adopted shows a political choice to wanting to show that there is sending a signal of commitment and hope to show that we are working united towards a sustainable recovery. However, after the adoption of the declaration, of course, there were several countries that were disassociating from specific paragraphs and even saying that they were rejecting certain paragraphs that they had just adopted in the declaration. So I think it's a difficult question because on the one hand, it does show that there's unity enough that we agree that we need to move forward together, but there was difficult paragraphs that countries felt that they needed to afterwards disassociate themselves from. So it's not a good answer, but I would love to hear in the chat what you all think, because I think it's a very interesting question.
May I add some things on Trina's answer? I think that, considering particularly the ministerial declaration, we're seeing how the pandemic impact in 2 different and maybe opposite ways in the way of doing of states. On the one hand, they are calling and they are assuming that there are not one-side solution, that we are all together in this, and the only way to go out from the pandemic and its impacts is working together. But at the same time, I think that the pandemics have extremed some positions, that now for different governments, it's more difficult to dialogue with others and to change their mindset on how the world should be built after the pandemics. And it led us to a very complex situation because they are all together when they speak about finding a common solution, but all of them are trying to impose their own solutions to everyone. I mean, they are not building a common solution. There are a few states that are trying to do so, and United Nations is trying to build that kind of equilibrium between different positions. But some governments are more closed to the discussion than before. I think that it is reflected in the ministerial declaration and in the decision of a lot of countries of dropping from some paragraphs. But I should also say that there are some issues that are absolutely not understandable from me. For example, when countries discussed or try to open the discussion on the role of women in sustainable development, I think that there is nothing to discuss there. This is a closed issue. We cannot move backwards that way. I cannot understand when countries discuss if children have or should have the opportunity to be part of the building of the new world. My gosh. But of course they have the right to participate. How can we discuss this? And I can add a lot of different issues. It was particularly impressive to me that a lot of countries dropped from the paragraph 8. Paragraph 8 refers to water management. So I think that the ministerial declaration this year are showing us that the discussion around water and water use it's becoming more and more important and urgent, and the positions are moving to the extremes. That it's a bad sign. And finally, I will mirror the declarations made at the final session by the UK representative when he said, we really need to write 18 pages to provide guidance to the countries on how to implement the 2030 agenda. I think that is the question to raise.
Thank you very much. There are a couple comments to quickly touch base on in considering the upcoming events that the 5th Conference on Least Developed Countries in Qatar is approaching, and the IUCN Marseille World Conservation Congress will also be taking place September 3rd through 10th. So Lynn, I didn't know if you wanted to quickly touch on how those tie into advancing the 2030 agenda. But thank you to our audience members who noted those. A couple of people have asked questions about improving the VNR process, which Javier, in your comments, I think you've been very open about how it really hasn't achieved what it was meant to, about being open, about being transparent about your challenges, as well as addressing solutions. So there are a few questions. What advice would you give to improve the VNRs? Do you have any reflections on how to better engage different stakeholders in the VNR process? And are there any specific points for joint advocacy at the national or at the regional level. And I'll open the floor again for anyone who wants to weigh in there. I'm sorry, Eleonora, you're speaking, but for some reason your microphone.
On mute. Okay. Yeah, no, actually, maybe I can quickly provide some comments on how a country can make their second VNR stand out and deliver. I had the opportunity to analyze some VNRs in the past years, and but also I want to mention that there are indeed structures within the UN where the member states can learn from each other and share their lessons learned on the VNR preparation. I mentioned at the very beginning that there were 17 VNR labs. Indeed, those are the sideline of the HLPF where countries and other stakeholders come together to share indeed their lessons learned on specific themes of the preparation of the VNRs. But as well, the regional forum ahead of the HLPF, there are the 5 UN regional commissions that organize indeed a week of discussions in preparation of the voluntary national reviews, and those are indeed the fora where the conversation on how to prepare the VNRs and share best practices as well is important. And it was also mentioned in a couple of meetings at this year's HLPF, the importance of regional forum indeed to as well bring the dimension, the local and regional, the local dimension, the VLRs that Javier mentioned, to include those findings in the as well in the VNRs. I also found at this year's HLPF that some reported indeed the VLRs in their documentation next to their VNRs. And also, yeah, I guess this is what I wanted to share on this point. Maybe Javier, Trin, or Lynn, would you like to add something else? Or if there is any other questions to answer.
I was not going to add anything on the VNRs, but in case Javier wants to come back to that, I just noted a question on around youth and how youth can take up space and participate meaningfully in these global events. And I would say there are, of course, several avenues to do that, also depending on the kinds of themes that you're interested in. But specifically speaking about the high-level political forum, we've seen that more and more countries are including youth representatives and giving them a prominent seat to perhaps open at the VNRs or be included when the countries are speaking. And I think really one of the best ways is for youth organizations to lobby at the national level to be included as part of the delegation to HLPF, because that's a way that you're really included as part of your country's delegation. So that's one way that I just wanted to highlight. And of course, it's an effort to lobby, but I think lobbying sometimes at the local level is the way to be included at the global level. So that's just one tip for that. And if it's specifically referring to the upcoming climate negotiations, I think we could point to that ISD has been part of creating a resource actually for young people on how to engage with the climate negotiations. So perhaps we could drop that in the chat for you all. That's all for me.
Okay, so I can highlight a couple of specific points that I think that would be important to answer the questions on VNRs. The first thing that I should say is I am part of the MGO's task group working on the HLPF. And I should say that every year, civil society around the world moves around the VNR's presentations and the voluntary national reviews processes. However, this is not a sustained work. I mean, states are not open enough to include civil society in many parts of the world. But it's equally true that some civil society organizations only worries about the VNR when the state decide to present a voluntary national report and when the state launch the process. And then they flag that they were not properly consulted. But the VNRs are part of a bigger process. And if civil society wants to really have a play a role in VNRs, it could not wait until the state decide to present a report. What I'm trying to say is that civil society is also responsible in some point on the lack of participation. Civil society have to move around this issue in a permanent way. I mean, it is not important if state present or not a report. Civil society should continue watching at the state. Civil society need to engage in the process of implementing the SDGs, no matter if the state decide to present or not a voluntary local national review or whatever. If civil society is really engaged, pushing from better information, better data, providing data, establishing links with the governments and other stakeholders responsible for reaching the SDGs at the country level, I think that we can expect a more robust participation of civil society in the VNR processes when the moment came. But we need to keep the momentum. We cannot go on, move only around the presentations of reports. That's the first idea that I want to highlight. And the second is related to how to prepare or to present a good second VNR. One tip. There are a lot of works written regarding this issue, but if you want just one tip, I can say a second VNR should start exactly where the first stopped. It not go back to the beginning of the story. It should continue the process that the first one started. And that means that it should start considering what happened with the next steps of the first report and what happened regarding the main challenges identified in the first report. That is the way that allows countries to report in a progress approach and not only like one photo after the other that tell us nothing on how things are moving in the everyday life.
Thank you. And I think we're getting close to the end of our time, but I think that those are some really good points to reflect on and to take us into the next year, that we need to start on the base of where we are and go forward. We all have responsibilities, we shouldn't just be waiting for our governments to do these things. The SDG framework really is for all of us to dig into. It's not just for governments or for the HLPF. It's for all of us to find our place in it and to look around and see who else is working on issues related to what we're doing, and to build the partnerships and to build towards the 2030 world that we want to see. So I think with that, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you, Eleonora, Trine, and Javier, and all of the people who have joined. Special thanks to you and Asia, who are up in the middle of the night, but for everyone who gave up their Friday afternoon, Friday morning, thank you. After a very intense 8 days, thank you for joining us. Keep in touch, and we look forward to seeing what happens in the next year.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, thank you. It was really a pleasure to share ideas here with you.